The skyline of New York glimmered under the pale morning sun, glass towers reflecting streaks of gold, as the city stirred with its usual pulse of ambition. Inside the tallest of them all, the Crawford Tower, the air already hummed with tension. Assistants scurried down marble hallways, clutching tablets and folders, whispering updates into sleek headsets. In less than 4 hours, the grand ballroom on the 50th floor would host the most important event in Crawford Industries' history. A summit that had drawn investors, journalists, and government officials from across the country. At the center of it all was Alexander Crawford. Billionaire, philanthropist, and figurehead of an empire that stretched from energy to technology. His face adorned business magazines and news networks. He embodied success, the kind that others only dreamed of. Yet, as he stood before the mirror in his office, adjusting a silk tie that already felt too tight, the mask of confidence began to slip. His palms were damp, his breath shallow, and his reflection showed the one truth he had never confessed publicly. Alexander Crawford was terrified of speaking to an audience. Public speaking had always been his invisible enemy. The memory of standing frozen in front of his college classmates still haunted him. The humiliation etched so deep that even decades of triumph had never erased it. His empire thrived on strategy and vision, but words, spoken in front of a crowd, remained a battlefield where he always lost. Today, with thousands of eyes waiting to judge his every syllable, the battlefield loomed closer than ever. Downstairs, unnoticed by the executives in tailored suits, Marlene Johnson polished the ballroom's long wooden table. At 55, she had worked in this building longer than most of its board members had held their seats. A widow from Harlem, she carried herself with quiet dignity, moving through corridors where she was often invisible to those in power. She knew every creak in the floor, every stubborn stain on the marble, every secret left half-whispered when men in suits assumed she wasn't listening. Marlene didn't envy their world. She had long accepted her place, though sometimes, late at night, she still thought of what might have been. She had once dreamed of teaching literature, of standing before students and guiding them through words that shaped nations. Life, however, had steered her differently after her husband's sudden passing, leaving her with bills, 2 children to raise, and no time for dreams. Now she worked with discipline and pride, though rarely with recognition. The ballroom today was unlike anything she had seen in years. Chandeliers sparkled above rows of chairs dressed in white linen. Cameras stood ready, their red lights soon to blink with live feeds to Wall Street and beyond. She noticed the tension in the air, the kind that trickled down from the top floors like invisible pressure. Even the waiters moving between tables seemed stiff, aware that this summit could tilt fortunes one way or another. Upstairs, Alexander paced his office, running through lines of his prepared speech. He whispered words under his breath, but they came out flat, fragile, like glass about to crack. His assistant knocked gently. "Sir, the cars have begun arriving. Reporters are already asking for statements." Alexander nodded, though his throat felt constricted. "I'll be ready," he lied. Outside, the city thrummed with its ceaseless rhythm, horns blaring, subways rumbling, voices rising from sidewalks. But inside Crawford Tower, the weight of expectation pressed down like a storm waiting to break. Neither Alexander nor Marlene knew that their paths would collide before the day was over, rewriting both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. And what unfolded in that ballroom would prove that sometimes the most powerful voices come from the most unexpected places. Before we step into the moment that will shake Alexander's empire and lift Marlene from the shadows of invisibility, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because what happens next is a story you won't want to miss. The day of the summit stretched over Alexander Crawford like a shadow he could not escape. For weeks, the board of Crawford Industries had spoken of nothing else. They wanted a speech that would dazzle investors, silence critics, and remind the world that their company stood at the forefront of American enterprise. The pressure weighed on Alexander with every passing hour, and though his name carried power, his confidence wavered whenever the thought of the podium returned. The corporate world he lived in was unforgiving. Wall Street's rhythm was fast, merciless, and built on perception. Numbers mattered, but so did the charisma of the man presenting them. Investors believed in vision only if it was delivered with conviction. Alexander knew that. He had mastered strategy, negotiation, and expansion, but standing before a crowd and persuading them with words still felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no ground beneath his feet. Late nights in his penthouse had become rituals of dread. He rehearsed lines before the mirror, repeating each sentence as though sheer repetition could chase away fear. His reflection, however, betrayed him with trembling lips and eyes that darted like a man cornered. Sometimes he slammed the papers down in frustration. "Why can I conquer markets but not this?" he muttered. Alone he admitted what he never confessed in public. He envied those who could speak freely, commanding attention without effort. The roots of his fear went deep. He still remembered his final year at Columbia University, when he froze in front of his classmates during a business presentation. His mind had gone blank, his throat closed up, and whispers of pity rippled through the room. Even then, professors praised his written work and analytical brilliance, but the humiliation of that moment burned so fiercely that every stage since felt like an ambush waiting to happen. Now, with the summit approaching, that fear returned sharper than ever. The boardroom meetings grew tense. "We can't afford another stumble, Alexander," said Raymond Price, a senior executive with a reputation for bluntness. "The whole market will be watching. If you falter, our rivals will circle like vultures." Alexander clenched his jaw. "I know what's at stake." Another board member, younger and more polished, leaned forward. "Then prove it. We've invested millions into this event." "Don't make us regret it." Though the words were professional, the undertone was clear. Their faith in him wasn't unconditional. Success had bought him loyalty, but it was fragile. In the corporate world, admiration lasted only until the next mistake. He could sense the unspoken calculation in their eyes. What would happen to the company if he failed? Meanwhile, Marlene Johnson moved quietly in the background of that empire. She polished the brass handles in the executive hallway and emptied wastebaskets that overflowed with discarded drafts of Alexander's speeches. She noticed the papers filled with corrections, scribbled notes and lines crossed out in frustration. Though she never dared to linger, she couldn't help but recognize the signs of a man unsettled. To Marlene, powerful men were not strangers. She had worked in Crawford Tower long enough to see them arrive with shining shoes and leave with grey faces after failed ventures. She understood more than most how fragile power could be, even when dressed in tailored suits. She often wondered what drove them so relentlessly, while she herself carried the simpler drive of survival, making sure the rent was paid, that her grandchildren had books for school, and that dignity remained intact despite the uniform she wore. As the hours dwindled before the summit, Alexander's anxiety built into something nearly unbearable. His chest tightened whenever he thought of the cameras, the hundreds of eyes waiting, the journalists eager for a headline. In quiet moments, he told himself he could still find a way out, but in truth, there was no escape. His name was printed on the invitations. His presence was expected. That night, standing by the window of his office as the city lights flickered below, he whispered into the glass as if confessing to himself, "What if I fail them all?" The city did not answer, only roared back with its endless traffic and restless ambition. Tomorrow he would face the crowd whether he was ready or not. The morning of the summit arrived with the city dressed in its usual rush. But inside Crawford Tower, every detail had been polished to perfection. The Metropolitan Ballroom glowed under crystal chandeliers, the scent of polished wood mingling with freshly cut white roses arranged along the aisles. Rows of chairs stretched in neat precision, waiting for the most influential figures of finance, politics, and media. The atmosphere was alive with anticipation, the kind that carried both promise and danger. Alexander Crawford stood in the wings of the ballroom, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He could hear the hum of conversation filtering in from the crowd, thousands of voices weaving into a restless symphony. Each laugh, each cough, each scrape of a chair sounded amplified, as if the room itself were mocking the tremor in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing, whispering fragments of the speech he had rehearsed, but the words slid away from his memory like water through cupped hands. His assistant, Evan, leaned in close. Sir, everyone's ready. You'll be introduced in 10 minutes. Alexander forced a nod, though his throat felt like it was closing. 10 minutes, he echoed, as if repeating the number would stretch time itself. Beyond the curtains, cameras were being adjusted. Journalists in crisp suits prepared notepads and microphones, hungry for a headline. Investors sat with gleaming watches and sharp expressions, their gazes fixed on the podium, as though the future of their fortunes depended on it, which in many ways it did. The board members occupied the front row, their posture rigid, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the stage with unspoken expectations. Marlene Johnson moved quietly among them, unnoticed in her black uniform and white gloves. She carried a tray of water glasses, weaving between the seats with practiced grace. Though invisible to most, she observed everything. The impatient tapping of a senator's shoe, the quiet murmur of an analyst predicting stock shifts, the tense smiles of board members masking nerves. She noticed Alexander, too, just beyond the curtain, shoulders stiff, jaw set too tightly. She had seen that look before, not in Men of Power, but in her grandson before his first school recital, a mixture of fear and pride battling inside. Backstage, Alexander pulled a folded page from his pocket. His eyes darted over the lines, but they blurred together. He swallowed hard, whispering, "You've built companies, you've survived crises, this is just words." Just words. Yet even as he said it, sweat trickled down his temples. His heart raced faster with every tick of the clock. Evan touched his arm gently. "Sir, you've done harder things than this. Just go out there and show them who you are." Alexander looked at him, his voice low. "I can fight markets, Evan. But I can't fight myself." The words slipped out before he could control them, and Evan had no reply. The master of ceremonies took the stage, his booming voice filling the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is my honor to welcome you to the annual Crawford Industries Summit. Please join me in receiving our keynote speaker, the man whose vision has shaped industries across the globe, Mr. Alexander Crawford." Thunderous applause erupted. The sound washed over Alexander like a wave that threatened to drown him. His legs felt unsteady as he took the first step forward. Each stride toward the podium seemed heavier than the last. By the time he reached the spotlight, the room had fallen into expectant silence, broken only by the faint clicking of cameras. Alexander gripped the edges of the podium, his fingers whitening against the polished wood. He looked out over the sea of faces, the lights glaring in his eyes, and for a heartbeat the entire room seemed to tilt. The words he had rehearsed vanished into the void. His throat closed, his chest tightened, and the silence stretched dangerously. The crowd waited. Alexander's breath hitched. Panic, sharp and unrelenting, began to rise. Alexander's grip on the podium tightened, as though the polished wood could anchor him to the moment. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, each breath carrying less air than the last. The spotlight burned against his skin, the brightness blinding him to anything but the endless rows of faces. Their eyes pressed against him, sharp as blades, waiting for him to deliver the words he had promised. But nothing came. He opened his mouth. "Good. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," he began, the words stumbling out in a cracked tone. He cleared his throat, tried again. "We are gathered," his voice faltered. The rest of the sentence withered before reaching air. Murmurs rippled across the ballroom, faint at first, then swelling into whispers that scratched at his ears. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, sliding into the corner of his eye. He blinked hard, but the sting only deepened the haze. His heart thudded so violently it seemed to echo inside his head. He tried to read from the notes laid out before him, but the letters swam together like black ink spilled on water. In the front row, Raymond Price exchanged a look with another board member. It was subtle, but Alexander caught it, and the sight hollowed his stomach. Doubt had already set in. The silence stretched. Journalists shifted in their seats, pens poised, cameras capturing every second of his unraveling. Alexander's throat closed tighter. He could hear his own ragged breathing amplified by the microphone. Each second he stood frozen added weight to the humiliation crushing him. Inside, he screamed at himself, "Say something, anything," but his body refused to obey. His hands trembled on the podium, his knees weakened, and he felt the room closing in like a cage. He tried to draw a deep breath, but his lungs seized, shallow gasps escaping instead. Panic, once a shadow, now towered over him in full. "Sir, are you all right?" someone whispered from the side, but the microphone carried the words across the room. Laughter broke out in the back rows, nervous at first, then sharper. The sound pierced him. Alexander's vision blurred. The chandelier above fractured into 1,000 shards of light, spinning, mocking. He swayed slightly, steadying himself only by clutching the podium harder. He could feel the collapse coming, the public unraveling of the image he had built for decades. Backstage, Evan pressed his hands to his mouth, horrified. He wanted to rush forward, but he knew it would only worsen the spectacle. The board members remained stiff, their expressions masks of polite concern, though their eyes revealed calculation. They were already thinking of contingencies, of futures without him. Among the staff moving quietly at the edges of the room, Marlene Johnson paused. She had been clearing away empty glasses when she saw Alexander freeze. Unlike the crowd, she recognized the raw panic in his eyes, the same kind of fear she had once seen in her own son before a school recital. It wasn't arrogance collapsing on stage. It was a man's humanity breaking through the armor of power. Alexander swallowed hard, forcing sound past the tightness in his throat. The future of Crawford Industries." The words trembled into fragments. He stopped again, unable to continue. A cough echoed from somewhere in the crowd, followed by shifting chairs and low murmurs. The humiliation thickened, pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. He stared at the sea of expectant faces, his vision tunneling. Inside, a single thought roared louder than the crowd. "This is the end. You're finished." The silence deepened until it was unbearable. His knees threatened to buckle, and he leaned harder into the podium, clinging to it like a drowning man. In that moment, as the world's judgment weighed down on him, Alexander Crawford stood not as a billionaire or a titan of industry, but as a man cornered by his own fear, seconds away from complete collapse. The silence in the ballroom grew unbearable, stretching into something raw and suffocating. Alexander clutched the podium, his knuckles pale, his breath shallow. He could feel the weight of every eye drilling into him, each second of inaction feeding whispers that spread like wildfire across the rows. The humiliation pressed harder, a storm inside his chest. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice spoke. Not loud, not commanding, but steady and warm. "Mr. Crawford," it said softly, though it carried just enough to be heard by those near the stage. Heads turned. A woman in a maid's uniform stood at the edge, holding nothing but a folded napkin in her hand. Marlene Johnson had not planned to move. She had spent 20 years keeping herself invisible, tending to the building without intruding on its rituals of power. Yet watching Alexander drown in silence triggered something instinctive. She had seen children falter during school recitals, church members freeze mid-hymn, and she knew that look, the desperate need for someone to steady them. Alexander's eyes darted toward her. For a brief moment, the audience disappeared. He saw not the maid but the calm in her gaze, a steadiness that reached through the storm inside him. Marlene took a hesitant step forward, her voice low, respectful. "If you'd like, I could help you with the words just until you catch your breath." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A maid stepping into the spotlight was unheard of, an intrusion into the sanctum of wealth and influence. Journalists leaned forward, sensing a story. Investors exchanged incredulous glances. The board members froze, unsure whether to be outraged or relieved. Alexander's throat worked, but no words came. His body trembled with indecision. To accept her offer was to admit weakness, but to refuse might mean complete collapse. The humiliation already clung to him like chains. He nodded almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. Marlene climbed the few steps to the stage. The ballroom's tension thickened, a mix of disbelief and curiosity. She reached for the papers on the podium, her movement steady, her gloved hand brushing the notes that Alexander had been unable to read. She glanced at him once more, as if to ask silently if he truly wanted this. His faint nod answered. Her voice filled the microphone, clear and measured. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this important day. Crawford Industries has always stood for resilience and innovation, and today, that vision continues. The words, simple as they were, landed with unexpected force. The crowd, startled at first, quieted into focus. Marlene spoke with the cadence of someone who believed in what she was reading, not as a performance, but as truth. The clarity of her tone carried confidence Alexander had not managed to summon. Alexander stood beside her, still gripping the podium, but slowly his breathing steadied. The panic that had strangled him moments before eased under the shelter of her voice. He studied her, astonished by the composure she held while standing before thousands. In the second row, a journalist whispered, "Who is she?" His colleague shrugged, already scribbling notes. Marlene read a paragraph, then paused, glancing at Alexander. "Would you like to continue?" she asked gently, audible only to him. His lips parted, but the words faltered again. Shame flushed through him, yet her eyes didn't judge. They simply offered space. He shook his head slightly and she resumed, carrying the speech forward. The ballroom, once thick with whispers, now hung on her every word. Even skeptics in the back leaned forward, curious about this woman who had stepped into a role no one expected. The board members exchanged uneasy but strangely hopeful looks. For the first time in his career, Alexander Crawford was not alone on stage. And for reasons he could not yet grasp, the world seemed captivated. Marlene's words poured into the microphone with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She wasn't delivering a performance. She was simply reading aloud with the natural rhythm she had once used when guiding her children through bedtime stories or helping her granddaughter with school assignments. Her cadence carried sincerity, a tone that wrapped itself around the room and softened the tension that had suffocated it minutes before. "The strength of Crawford Industries has always been rooted in people," she read, her voice warm yet firm. "From innovators designing the future to workers ensuring every detail meets excellence, this company thrives because of dedication and vision." The crowd, initially restless, quieted completely. The investors who had tapped their pens impatiently now leaned forward. Journalists stilled their hands over notebooks, realizing that something unusual, something genuine, was unfolding before them. Even the cameras seemed to focus more sharply, their red lights blinking as they captured every word. Alexander, still gripping the podium, felt the shift like a tide changing course. The panic that had strangled him gave way to a fragile calm. His chest loosened, his vision cleared enough to truly see the room again. More than anything, he noticed how the audience responded not with ridicule but with awe, and all of it was because of Marlene. He whispered, almost to himself, "How is she doing this?" Marlene glanced at him briefly, her eyes steady, then turned back to the speech. She didn't need recognition, she needed to get him through this. On the far side of the ballroom, Raymond Price folded his arms, whispering to another executive. "This is unorthodox, but listen, they're captivated." Indeed, the audience was no longer murmuring about failure. They were listening. And as Marlene continued, her natural eloquence turned the dry corporate lines into something human. She spoke of resilience not as a hollow business phrase, but as a truth lived every day by people like her. Though she didn't alter the prepared words, her delivery gave them weight. Midway through, a ripple of applause broke out from the back of the room. It startled her for a second, but she continued, her voice even stronger. Soon nods spread through the audience. Some whispered to each other not with mockery, but with admiration. Alexander felt his pulse steady. He straightened, his shoulders squaring again. For the first time since stepping on stage, he believed he might survive this moment. More than survival, he felt the faint stirrings of pride, not in himself but in the woman who had stepped in when no one else dared. At a pause in the speech, Marlene leaned slightly toward him. Her words meant only for his ears. "Take a breath. Try one line." He hesitated, fear still clawing at him, but her calmness anchored him. He managed to speak, his voice low but audible. "Together, we face the future with courage and determination." The crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't thunderous yet, but it was enough to show the tide had turned. Encouraged, Alexander glanced at Marlene. She gave a small nod, as if to say, "You're not alone." From there, she continued reading, weaving her voice with his occasional phrases. The partnership formed seamlessly, surprising everyone in the room, including Alexander himself. By the time she reached the closing lines, the ballroom was alive with energy. What had begun as a humiliation had transformed into something extraordinary. The audience leaned into every word, not for the numbers and projections, but for the authenticity that pulsed beneath the delivery. When the final sentence left her lips, a long silence lingered before the entire room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled furiously, and the investors rose to their feet. The moment was undeniable. The Maid had carried the Billionaire through disaster, and together they had turned collapse into triumph. Alexander stood still, overwhelmed, his heart pounding with relief. He knew everything had changed, but he couldn't yet see how far the ripples would spread. The final applause still echoed when Alexander and Marlene stepped away from the podium. For a moment neither spoke. The thunder of hands clapping, the flashes of cameras, the hum of voices, it all blended into a surreal haze. Alexander's knees still trembled from the collapse he had narrowly escaped, yet a strange current of relief surged through him. He had survived, but not by his own strength. As they exited the stage, Evan rushed forward, whispering urgently, "Sir, that was, I don't know what to call it, unbelievable. The press is going wild." Alexander barely heard him. He turned to Marlene, his voice rough but sincere. "You saved me out there." Marlene shook her head gently. "I only read what was written. The words were yours." "No," he said, his tone firmer, his eyes locking on hers. "The courage was yours." Marlene lowered her gaze, unused to attention, and tried to step back into her familiar role of invisibility. But the spell of anonymity had already been broken. Around them, journalists swarmed, their questions sharp and eager. "Who was she? Is she part of your staff? Was this planned?" Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every angle of the unexpected duo. Raymond Price pushed through the crowd, his expression controlled, but his eyes flickering with calculation. "Mr. Crawford, the press is asking for a statement. We should manage the narrative before it gets out of hand." Alexander hesitated, his instincts urging him to retreat, but he caught sight of Marlene slipping quietly toward the back hallway, her shoulders hunched as if hoping to vanish again. Something inside him resisted letting her disappear. "Not yet," he said to Raymond. "Let them write whatever they want for now." Back in the ballroom, clusters of investors buzzed with conversation. Some praised the authenticity of the moment, saying it showed Crawford Industries as a company grounded in real people. Others were skeptical, muttering about professionalism and image. One senator chuckled to a colleague, "That Maid had more composure than half the CEOs I've heard." Meanwhile, Marlene returned to her duties, avoiding the journalists who craned their necks to spot her. She wiped down a table as if nothing had happened, but her hands trembled slightly. She had not sought the spotlight. Stepping in had been instinct, a human response to another person's struggle. Yet she knew the moment had drawn her into a world she never wished to enter. In his private office, Alexander tried to catch his breath. He loosened his tie and leaned against the desk, staring out at the skyline. He replayed the moment again and again. The silence, the collapse, and then her voice carrying him through. Relief mingled with shame. He was the man expected to lead, yet it was Marlene, a maid, who had shown the strength he lacked. Evan entered quietly, holding a tablet. "The headlines are already live. Maid saves CEO from meltdown. Unexpected hero at Crawford Summit. Sir, it's everywhere." Alexander rubbed his temples. "Of course it is. They'll twist it however they want. Some of them are calling it inspiring," Evan added. "The clip is already going viral." Alexander exhaled, half a laugh, half despair. "Inspiring or humiliating? I can't tell yet." He turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in years he felt exposed, stripped of the armor that money and power usually provided. And yet beneath the vulnerability, something unexpected stirred. Gratitude. Downstairs, Marlene finished her shift in silence. Colleagues whispered, some congratulating her, others warning her that stepping into the spotlight could bring trouble. She brushed it off. "I only did what anyone would do," she said softly, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. Few would have risked what she had. And as Alexander sat alone in his office, one thought refused to leave him. He had been rescued not by another executive, not by a polished speechwriter, but by the woman everyone else overlooked. The evening quiet settled over Crawford Tower after the chaos of the summit. The last of the investors had left, their conversations lingering in the air like the scent of expensive cologne. The ballroom stood empty, littered with half-empty glasses and crumpled napkins, the grandeur stripped bare once the crowd dispersed. Upstairs, Alexander sat in his office, restless. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. But his mind was not on contracts or numbers. It was on Marlene, the maid who had stepped into the storm and steadied him when no one else could. He replayed her calm voice, the composure with which she had carried the room, the steadiness in her eyes. He felt something strange, respect mixed with curiosity, tinged with guilt. He had built an empire, yet had needed someone invisible to hold him up. Unable to let the night end without addressing it, Alexander left his office and made his way to the staff quarters on a lower floor. The air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, and the fluorescent lights buzzed softly above. He found her seated on a wooden bench near the lockers, her uniform folded neatly over her lap, her hair wrapped in a scarf. She looked weary, but at peace, as though she had already put the day behind her. "Marlene," he said softly, unsure if he even had the right to speak her name. She looked up, surprised. "Mr. Crawford, I didn't expect—" "I had to thank you," he interrupted, his voice lower than usual, stripped of authority. "You saved me today. Without you, I would have—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Marlene shook her head gently. "You would have found your way. People underestimate their own strength." "No," Alexander replied firmly. "I was drowning. And you threw me a rope." She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I didn't plan it. I just couldn't stand there and watch you crumble. It reminded me of my son when he was young. He froze once at a school recital. I couldn't let him sink. I couldn't let you either." Something softened in Alexander's chest. "Your voice. It carried more conviction than mine ever could." "Have you done public speaking before?" Marlene chuckled, shaking her head. "Not in a ballroom like that, but I once dreamed of teaching, literature, maybe history. I wanted to stand in front of a classroom to help young people find their voices. Life had other plans, bills, children, responsibilities. Dreams don't always pay rent." Her words struck him harder than any critique ever had. He saw the truth in her eyes, the quiet resilience that came from decades of sacrifice. She had once aimed for a life beyond these walls, but had chosen duty over ambition. "Do you regret it?" he asked gently. Marlene looked down at her folded uniform. "Sometimes, but regret doesn't feed anyone. I take pride in what I do." "Still, standing on that stage today, for a second it felt like stepping into the life I left behind." Alexander swallowed, his voice quieter now. "You have more dignity than anyone I've met in that boardroom. They don't see it, but I do. You taught me something today. Fear doesn't vanish, but courage is found in the choice to act anyway." She met his gaze, her eyes calm. "Then maybe you're stronger than you think. You just need to believe it." For a long moment neither spoke. The hum of the lights filled the silence between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Alexander nodded, his voice steady. "This isn't the last time we speak. I won't let it be." Marlene gave a faint smile, though her eyes carried caution. "We'll see, Mr. Crawford." "We'll see." The next morning, sunlight spilled across the glass walls of Crawford Tower, but inside the executive boardroom the mood was sharp and cold. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lights, polished so perfectly it reflected the anxious faces gathered around it. Alexander entered quietly, his jaw tight, aware that every eye in the room was waiting for him. Raymond Price, seated near the head of the table, wasted no time. "Alexander, Last night's summit was unconventional, to put it mildly. Investors are split and the media is running wild. We need to address the optics immediately. Alexander took his seat, resisting the urge to rub his temples. The optics are that the speech was delivered, the message was heard, and the crowd applauded. Raymond leaned forward. By a maid, not by you. His voice cut like steel. Do you understand how this looks? Our CEO paralyzed, rescued by a cleaning staff member. Some see inspiration, others see weakness. A younger board member, Lila Monroe, spoke with a calmer tone but equal concern. The narrative is unpredictable. Social media is flooded with clips. Half the comments are praising authenticity, the other half are mocking the company for losing control of its image. Another voice chimed in from across the table. Shareholders are calling. They want reassurance that leadership isn't compromised. Wall Street thrives on confidence, not vulnerability. Alexander listened, the words gnawing at him. He had expected criticism, but the bluntness still stung. Finally he replied, his voice measured. What happened on that stage was not scripted, but it showed resilience in the face of collapse. People may mock me, but they also saw that I wasn't alone. They saw the truth, that leadership isn't just about a single man's voice. Raymond scoffed. Truth doesn't build stock value, Alexander. Perception does. And right now, perception is fragile. The world thinks you can't deliver a speech without leaning on the help of a janitor. The word hung heavy in the air, laced with disdain. Alexander's jaw clenched. Her name is Marlene Johnson. And she carried herself with more grace than most people I've seen in this room. A silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at their papers, unwilling to meet his eyes. Lila leaned in gently. We're not dismissing her courage, Alexander, but the question is, what does this mean for the company? Do we embrace the story and risk undermining your authority, or do we bury it and risk being seen as dishonest? The dilemma was clear. The incident could be spun into a tale of authenticity and humanity, but it could also cement doubts about Alexander's ability to lead. Either path carried risk. Alexander thought of Marlene, of her calm strength and the quiet dignity in her voice. He refused to let her be reduced to a footnote in their calculations. We will not bury it, he said firmly. The moment happened, and it mattered. Pretending it didn't exist would be cowardice. I won't erase her part in it. Raymond shook his head, his lips curling. Then you may lose the board's confidence, and once that goes, the empire you built will begin to slip. The tension thickened. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the divide between himself and the men and women who were supposed to stand behind him. He knew he had crossed into dangerous territory, but his conviction held steady. As the meeting drew to a close, the board remained unsettled, the conflict unresolved. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the battles unfolding inside the tower. But Alexander sensed that this was only the beginning of a larger reckoning, one that would test not only his leadership, but the values he stood for. Alexander left the boardroom with the weight of their doubts pressing against his chest, yet instead of retreating to his penthouse or drowning himself in work, he found his thoughts drifting back to Marlene. Her steadiness still echoed in his mind, a quiet defiance against the collapse that had nearly destroyed him. He realized then that he didn't want her role in his survival to end as a passing moment. That evening, he requested Evan to find her. When she arrived at his office, still in her uniform and hesitant to step inside, Alexander gestured toward a chair. Please sit. You don't need to stand in front of me. Marlene raised her brows slightly, her voice steady. Mr. Crawford, I don't usually find myself in this kind of room. Neither do I, he admitted, surprising even himself. At least not like this. For a moment, silence lingered between them. Then Alexander leaned forward. I need your help. Not as a maid, not as staff, but as someone who sees what others miss. I want you to help me prepare for my speeches. Marlene blinked, startled. Me? Sir, I've never trained anyone. I'm not a coach. You don't have to be, Alexander replied. What you did on that stage, and it wasn't training, it was instinct. You knew how to calm the room, how to give weight to words. You've got something I don't. And I need it. She shook her head slowly, conflicted. I'm just a woman who reads bedtime stories to her grandkids. You're asking me to shape a billionaire's voice? That doesn't sound right. Alexander's expression softened. What sounds right is that you believed in the words when I couldn't. You reminded me they're more than lines on a page. That's what I need to learn. Marlene exhaled, folding her hands in her lap. If I say yes, I'll speak truth. I won't flatter you or spare your pride. Are you prepared for that? He gave a faint smile, the first genuine one in days. I wouldn't ask for anything less. From then on, their unusual partnership began. Late at night, when the ballroom stood empty and the tower had quieted, they met to rehearse. Marlene stood at the back, her arms crossed, while Alexander practiced lines under the glow of chandeliers. At first, his words still stumbled, his voice uneven. Each time he faltered, frustration burned across his face. Stop rushing, Marlene told him one night, her tone firm but never unkind. You sound like you're trying to outrun your fear. Slow down, let the words breathe. He tried again, speaking slower, and though his voice wavered, the difference was clear. Better, she said simply. Other times, she interrupted him mid-sentence. You don't believe what you're saying, the audience will know it. Try again, but this time mean it. Alexander bristled at first, unaccustomed to being corrected by anyone, let alone someone outside his world, yet each correction chipped away at the armor of pretense he had worn for years. Slowly, beneath Marlene's steady guidance, he found rhythm. He learned when to pause, when to let silence speak louder than words, and when to meet the gaze of an invisible crowd instead of shrinking from it. As nights turned into weeks, their sessions grew less about speeches and more about resilience. They spoke of fear, dignity, and the strange paths life carved. Alexander revealed the humiliation of his college breakdown. Marlene shared her story of sacrificing her dream of teaching. Each conversation stripped away another layer of the distance between them. One night, after he had managed to deliver a full speech without faltering, Alexander looked at her with quiet gratitude. You've given me more than a voice, Marlene. You've given me courage. She shook her head, but a small smile tugged at her lips. No, Mr. Crawford, the courage was always there. You just needed someone to remind you of it. And in that moment, Alexander realized this partnership was no longer about saving face. It was about transformation. The story spread faster than wildfire. By dawn, every major outlet carried the headline in some variation. Billionaire CEO saved by Maid's poise. Clips of Marlene's steady voice on stage flooded social media, shared with captions like, "True leadership isn't about titles," and "The courage of the overlooked." Within hours, millions had watched. Alexander sat in his office, the blinds half closed, his phone vibrating with endless notifications. News anchors debated the meaning of the incident, some calling it a refreshing display of humanity, others branding it a disaster for corporate image. Satirical late-night shows mocked him with exaggerated impressions, while human interest programs hailed Marlene as an unlikely heroine. Evan scrolled through a tablet, reading updates aloud. NBC is requesting an interview. CNN, too. There's a trending hashtag, Marlene Speaks. Sir, this has gone beyond the business world. It's cultural now. Alexander rubbed his forehead. And what are the investors saying? Split, Evan admitted. Some see it as authenticity, a story that makes you relatable. Others think it undermines your authority. The stock dipped this morning, but it's stabilizing. People are waiting to see how you respond. Alexander sighed. He had built an empire on strategy, numbers, and image, but now, for the first time, his fate wasn't entirely in his control. It was tied to Marlene's presence, to the narrative the world had crafted around her. Meanwhile, Marlene walked the streets of Harlem with her grocery bag in hand, startled by strangers who now recognized her. A young woman stopped her near the corner store. Are you the lady from the Crawford speech? Marlene hesitated, shifting the bag against her hip. I suppose I am. You were amazing, the woman said earnestly. You gave me chills. My mom works 2 jobs, and when I saw you up there, it felt like you spoke for all of us. Marlene offered a polite smile, touched yet uneasy. She hadn't stepped in to make a statement for anyone but Alexander in that moment. Still, she realized her actions now carried meaning far beyond her intent. At home, her granddaughter showed her the viral clip on a phone. "Grandma, you're famous." "Everyone's talking about you." Marlene chuckled, shaking her head. "I'm not famous, I just helped someone who needed it." But deep down, she felt the weight of the attention, a spotlight she had never asked for. Back at the tower, the board convened in urgent meetings. Raymond Price's voice boomed with frustration. "We need control of the narrative before this spirals." "He looks weak and she looks like the real leader," Alexander cut him off sharply. "She was the leader in that moment, and maybe the world needed to see that." Raymond slammed his hand against the table. "Do you hear yourself? You're glorifying an accident. She's a maid, Alexander. She doesn't belong in the boardroom of global strategy." Alexander's gaze hardened. "Perhaps not in the boardroom. But she belongs in this story, whether you like it or not, and I won't erase her." The room fell silent. Lila Monroe finally spoke, her tone careful. "Then the question becomes how we integrate her into the company's image, without alienating the investors who still cling to old hierarchies." It was a delicate line to walk. Too much praise for Marlene, and Alexander risked looking like he had surrendered authority. Too little, and the world would accuse him of dismissing the very woman who had saved him. That night, Alexander appeared briefly on television, delivering a measured statement. The summit was not what anyone expected. I froze, and in that moment, Marlene Johnson stepped in with grace and strength. She reminded me, and perhaps all of us, that leadership comes in many forms. I owe her my gratitude. The clip went viral within minutes. Some praised his honesty, others mocked his dependence. But one truth was undeniable. The story was far from over, and the storm of attention showed no sign of fading. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later, embossed in gold and bearing the seal of the nation's capital, the International Economic Forum in Washington, D.C. It was the kind of event Alexander Crawford could not avoid. Heads of state, world-renowned economists and industry giants would gather to discuss the global market. The keynote was his. For most CEOs, it was an honor. For Alexander, it was a reckoning. He held the letter in his office, staring at it like a challenge thrown at his feet. The board expected him to redeem himself or confirm their worst fears. Investors expected him to project strength. And the press, they wanted another spectacle. His palms began to sweat just reading the words. That evening, he found Marlene in the ballroom, tidying the rows of chairs after a corporate dinner. She looked up as he approached, the same steady calm in her eyes that had carried him weeks before. "They've invited me to Washington," he said quietly. She set the chair down, folding her arms. "And you're afraid?" "Yes," he admitted. The word came out raw, unguarded. "I'm afraid of standing there with the cameras, the world watching. Afraid I'll collapse again." Marlene studied him for a moment before speaking. "Fear doesn't vanish, Mr. Crawford. It sits in the room, waiting. The question is whether you let it choke you or whether you speak anyway." Her words lingered with him through long nights of practice. Together they rehearsed speech after speech, refining rhythm, pacing, and presence. Alexander stumbled, corrected himself, stumbled again. Marlene never let him surrender. "Slower," she reminded him when his sentences rushed. "Look up. Don't hide in the paper. Speak to them as if they matter, not as if you're begging them to believe." And when frustration finally broke through his composure, she answered it with quiet firmness. "You've carried companies through storms. Don't tell me you can't carry yourself through words." The day of the forum arrived under a grey Washington sky. The Grand Hall shimmered with marble columns and polished brass, flags from dozens of nations hanging proudly. Security lines stretched for blocks, reporters shouted questions, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Backstage, Alexander stood in a tailored navy suit, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. He felt the familiar panic tugging at his chest. But this time, when he turned his head, Marlene was there. She had traveled with him, not as staff, but as someone he trusted. She gave him a single nod, calm and steady, as though her quiet presence could silence the storm inside him. "You know the words," she told him softly. "But more than that, you know the truth. Speak it. The rest will follow." When his name was announced, applause greeted him, not thunderous but polite, measured. He walked to the podium, every step heavy but deliberate. The lights shone in his eyes, the cameras blinked, and for a brief moment the fear clawed again at his throat. Then he remembered Marlene's words. "Speak anyway." He began, slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand here not as a flawless man, but as a man who knows the weight of failure and the value of resilience." His voice, though shaky at first, grew stronger with each sentence. He paused when needed, looked into the crowd instead of down at the paper, and let silence work in his favor. The room shifted, leaning closer. Minutes passed, then 20. By the time he delivered his final line, "The future is not built by those who never falter, but by those who rise again," the hall erupted in applause, this time genuine and thunderous. Backstage, Marlene smiled, pride flickering across her face. Alexander met her eyes, his chest rising with relief. For the first time in his life he had spoken and been heard. The applause from Washington still echoed in Alexander's mind days after he returned to New York. For the first time in decades, he felt unshackled from the invisible chains of fear. He had spoken clearly, steadily, without collapsing. The success wasn't his alone, though. He knew it. Every word, every pause, every ounce of courage had been built from those late-night sessions with Marlene. When he entered the boardroom, the air was different. The same executives who had doubted him now greeted him with cautious respect. Even Raymond Price, though reluctant, acknowledged the achievement. "You held the room, Alexander," he admitted. "The markets responded well. Investors are satisfied." Alexander nodded, though inside he felt something deeper than satisfaction. It wasn't about the markets anymore. It was about reclaiming a part of himself he had thought forever broken, and that reclamation had come from an unexpected source. The transformation began to ripple outward. Reporters asked less about his collapse and more about his message. Employees across Crawford Industries spoke of him with new admiration. But Alexander resisted the temptation to claim the credit alone. At a press briefing, he surprised many by saying, "My growth as a leader is thanks to voices that once went unheard. It's time we listen to those voices more." Those words sparked conversations within the company. Employees from janitors to junior analysts felt seen in a way they hadn't before. For once, leadership didn't feel like a fortress of glass towers. It felt human. Meanwhile, Marlene's life shifted in quiet but meaningful ways. Her colleagues in the cleaning staff looked at her differently, some with admiration, others with curiosity. Strangers stopped her on the street thanking her for what she had done, yet she remained grounded. She still rose before dawn, still scrubbed the same marble floors, still carried herself with quiet dignity. But something had changed within her too. She began browsing brochures from community colleges, revisiting the dream she had once buried. Teaching had felt impossible after her husband's death, but now she wondered if it was too late, or if the door might still be open. One evening, as she folded chairs in the ballroom, Alexander approached her. "You've given me more than I can repay," he said quietly, "but I want to try. If teaching is what you once dreamed of, I'll make sure you have the chance." Marlene shook her head firmly. "I didn't step on that stage for favors. I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," Alexander replied. "It's recognition. You reminded me that leadership isn't about power. It's about people. And people like you deserve the chance to step into the roles they were meant for." Her eyes softened, though she remained cautious. "And what if I fail?" He smiled faintly, echoing the lesson she had once given him. "Then you'll rise again. That's what you taught me." The conversation lingered with her through sleepless nights. She imagined standing before a classroom, chalk in hand, her voice guiding students through stories and lessons. She imagined her grandchildren proud, their grandmother not just a maid, but a teacher, someone who had fought her way back to an old dream. For Alexander, the transformation deepened. He began championing new initiatives, scholarships for employees' families, mentorship programs for workers who wanted to rise beyond their roles. "Talent exists everywhere," he told the board. "We've just been too blind to see it." Some resisted, grumbling about costs and distractions, but others felt the tide shifting. Investors who once doubted him now praised his vision for inclusive leadership. Public opinion, too, warmed. The billionaire, once mocked for panic, had become a symbol of growth. Still, Alexander knew the true measure of his change wasn't in headlines or profits. It was in the quiet partnership he had formed with a woman who had once been invisible. And as Marlene cautiously considered stepping toward her old dream, Alexander found himself determined to help her succeed, not as a savior, but as someone finally awake to the power of unlikely voices. The season turned in New York, the crisp air carrying the bite of autumn as leaves painted the streets in shades of amber and gold. From the glass walls of Crawford Tower, Alexander watched the city with a reflective calm he had never known before. Success had always been measured in numbers, profits, mergers, stock values, but now he saw his empire through a different lens. It wasn't numbers that had saved him on that stage. It was a voice no one had expected. He carried that thought into every decision, every meeting. The board remained skeptical at times, but even Raymond Price had begun to soften his tone. The Washington speech had stabilized the company's standing, yet Alexander refused to return to business as usual. Legacy is not about control, he told them in a recent meeting. It's about impact. The room had fallen silent, the words landing with a weight they didn't fully understand. But Alexander knew what he meant. He had built a fortress of glass and steel, yet it was Marlene, a woman they had all walked past countless times, who had shown him the true foundation of resilience. Marlene herself was preparing for change. After long nights of doubt, she finally enrolled in evening classes at a local community college. Sitting in a small classroom with students half her age, she felt both fear and exhilaration. She scribbled notes diligently, her hands slightly stiff from years of work, but her mind alive with the spark she thought she had lost forever. One afternoon, as she finished her shift at the tower, Alexander found her in the lobby carrying her books in a worn satchel. "How are the classes?" he asked. She smiled faintly, tired but proud. "Hard, but good. I forgot how much I loved learning. Sometimes I feel like I don't belong there, but then I remind myself, I've waited long enough for this chance." Alexander nodded. "Belonging isn't given, Marlene. It's claimed, and you've claimed it." Word of her decision spread quietly among staff. To many, she became an emblem of courage, proof that it wasn't too late to chase what had once been lost. Her presence inspired whispers of possibility. Junior employees began asking about training programs. Security guards spoke of side businesses they dreamed of starting. The culture within the tower shifted, not by policy but by example. Weeks later, another summit drew investors back to the Metropolitan Ballroom. This time the anticipation was different. Alexander walked onto the stage with a steady stride, his voice carrying confidence rooted not in bravado, but in truth. He spoke of innovation, yes, but also of humanity, of the unseen workers who built the foundations of success. And then, to the surprise of many, he paused. His eyes swept the audience before he said, "I would not stand here today if not for Marlene Johnson. Her strength gave me mine. This company owes her gratitude, not for a moment, but for a reminder that every voice matters." The applause was thunderous, not just polite. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and even the most skeptical board members couldn't deny the impact. For once, the headlines didn't focus on profits or stock prices, they focused on humanity. Marlene sat at the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't seeking recognition, but as the crowd rose to their feet, tears welled in her eyes. She had once believed her dreams were buried forever, but in that moment she realized her story had already changed more than her own life. For Alexander, the turning point of his legacy had arrived. No longer would he be remembered solely as a billionaire who built an empire of steel and glass. He would be remembered as the man who learned, too late but not too late, that greatness sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Winter's chill settled over New York, the wind carrying flurries of snow that dusted the city in white. Inside Crawford Tower, the warmth of golden lights softened the sharp lines of glass and steel. For Alexander Crawford, the season marked more than the close of a year. It marked the end of a chapter in his life, and the beginning of another. He sat by his office window one evening, looking down at the streets where bundled crowds hurried through the cold. The skyline glittered, yet his thoughts wandered to something far simpler. He thought of Marlene Johnson, her voice steady on the stage, her quiet dignity in every word, her courage to step forward when no one else dared. Without her, he knew, his empire might have unraveled. Instead, she had given him a chance to rebuild not just his reputation, but himself. Marlene, too, stood at a crossroads. Her first semester at community college was nearly complete. The halls smelled faintly of chalk and old books, and though she often felt out of place among younger students, she found herself thriving. She stayed late after classes, lingering in the library, her fingers brushing the spines of novels she had once only dreamed of teaching. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt alive, her dream no longer a memory but a path unfolding. One afternoon, Alexander visited her modest apartment in Harlem, bringing with him a stack of books. "For your studies," he said, handing them over. Marlene chuckled, shaking her head. "Mr. Crawford, I can't have you spoiling me." "This isn't spoiling," he replied gently. "It's investment. In someone who already proved she's worth more than anyone gave her credit for." She studied him for a moment before replying, "And what about you? Have you found what you were searching for?" Alexander exhaled slowly. "I think I've found something better. I stopped searching for perfection. I learned to stand even when fear tried to pull me down. And I owe that to you." Her smile was small but genuine. "Then we both found something." As the year drew to a close, Alexander delivered his final address at the company's holiday gathering. The ballroom, decorated with garlands and golden lights, was filled with employees from every level: executives, assistants, janitors, security guards. This time he spoke without trembling, his voice steady and warm. He didn't talk only of profits or projections. He spoke of resilience, of humanity, of the strength found in unexpected places. And once again, he named Marlene before the entire company, crediting her not only for saving a moment, but for reminding him of what leadership truly meant. The applause that followed was not just for him, it was for both of them, a shared recognition of courage. Afterward, Alexander stood quietly by the decorated tree in the corner of the hall. He felt lighter, freer, as though he had finally stepped out of the shadow of fear. His legacy would not be built solely on steel and numbers, but on humility, authenticity, and a maid who had taught him what it meant to rise. Marlene, standing at the back of the room with her satchel of books, felt tears sting her eyes. She had stepped in only to help a man in need, never imagining it would change the course of her life. Now she carried within her not just hope, but purpose. And as their paths continued forward, his as a leader renewed, hers as a student reclaiming her dream, the truth was undeniable. Greatness often comes from the most unexpected voices. Before we close this story, don't forget, subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next tale of resilience and transformation. And if you're ready to continue this journey of inspiring stories, click the video suggested on your screen now. The next chapter is waiting.